So, the program. Cheers.
Cheers. The main one.
Everybody is waiting. To us. Skål.
How do you say cheers?
Norok. Norok. Idea, ne. Okay. We are going to have the entree. Then there will be the main course, which will be very young. Then there will be a subsequent main course, which will be eating. Then there will be something else, I guess. Then when we feel like going to bed, we will go to bed. And then we meet at 10 o'clock. Now, what we have missed today, we have missed walking on the banks of the Mureș. This river is at the center, of course, of the city's life. So the question really is, if you want to get up early in the morning, walk on the bank. Okay, well, probably you can put back the microphone back into your ears, because now the cabinet can actually hear you. Great. So Marianne, there is something to remember. You have to speak into the last. Bon appetit. It gives me great pleasure to welcome us all to the presentation that will probably be one of the highlights of the event. Marianne might dispute my next point, because on the family tree we are kind of distant, kind of falling off, false cousin. But I really feel that we are a family, and probably much closer than false cousin. And I would like you to listen to Marianne's presentation, because at the end of it, after question time, I have a project for all of us to consider. So Marianne.
Thank you so much. And it's really wonderful to look around and see everyone here. You know, this is a remarkable audience that is connected not just by interest or identity, but by sort of the meanderings of DNA. And I look around and I see a few familiar faces, and one, most of all, who deserves my gratitude. On the 20th of August, 2016, I received a surprising email from my cousin Tom de Kornfeld. And he said he had gotten off the phone just now with a cousin named Peter Fritz. And he said that if I were in Budapest, he was having a lunch the next day and he would like me to join him. And I said I was very grateful, but unfortunately I was not in Budapest at the time. And then I received what I later learned was an unusually talkative and uncharacteristically chatty response, in which Peter wrote, "Dear Marianne, thank you for your email. It would have been a wonderful coincidence. Let's try to meet with better planning." Eva Kanitz is my third great aunt. That makes you a fourth cousin. I've watched you on YouTube, great presentation, and have ordered 4 copies of your book. By way of introduction, you can Google Peter Fritz. I live in Sydney, Australia. As I told Tom, I do not make it a practice to contact close or distant relatives. But next year we will celebrate 300 years of my 12th great-grandfather being allowed to settle in INARAD, Transylvania. He was the first Jew to do so. I'm organizing several events, as well as helping renovate the Jewish cemetery where Rabbi Koren is buried. It is set for the 5th, 6th, and 7th of October 2017. Invitations should go out in a few months. Hope you will make it. In the meantime, consider this as an email. It is an open invitation to Sydney, KRP. That was the longest email I have gotten from Peter, and I know many of you have. But thus began one of the most surprising and beshert encounters of my life. A friendship that began with an exchange of emails and has included a fantastic visit to Sydney and the introduction to Vika and Alexander and Catherine and her family, and several phone calls every month or 6 weeks that included conversations about Trump, about politics, about Jews, about America, about life, about books, and now the opportunity to meet even more of this extended, remarkable family. So once more, Peter, debts that are very difficult to repay must at least be acknowledged. So thank you very much. We're all gathered here in INARAD at the beginning of the year of 5778. And it's somehow fitting, I think, that we should be together right after the high holidays. There are among us Christians, observant Jews, cultural Christians, and a whole variety of faiths and identities. And yet, we can't help but face a very basic question, which is, who is a Jew, and what does it mean to be Jewish? And how is that expressed in a life? We saw very much how it was expressed in the 20th century, and that's what I will be talking with you about today. At least one tiny part of the 20th century, involving one tiny part of our family. There's an old joke that goes to the heart of the question. I have no idea how this got louder. Oh, because, okay. A hunchback and a Jew were walking through the streets of Krakow in Poland about 20 years after the war. They passed an old ruined synagogue, and the hunchback, and the Jew turns to the hunchback and says, you know, I used to be a Jew. And the hunchback says, yeah, I used to be a hunchback. And so I think that there is something to that. We will be spending some time learning about the fantastic story of Rabbi Koren and the Jews of INARAD. And you will see this lost world and this new world through the biography of your father and your grandfather and your cousin and your friend and your uncle and your benefactor. But as I look around the room, I know that there are so many remarkable stories. In fact, every family has one. There's stories of humor and drama and pathos, and occasional hilarity, of historical importance and powerful personalities. So this evening, I'm going to share with you my story, or the story of my family, and their experience during the Second World War and through a bit of the 20th century. It's a story of Hungary during that very complicated historical period. And it's also the perplexing and idiosyncratic story of Hungarian Jewry, the complicated relationship, thank you so much, Catherine, I want to, that Hungary had with its Jewish population and with the rest of the world. This is a country, which we will be visiting in the next few days, where 600,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered, where Adolf Eichmann, with breathtaking efficiency, organized their extermination in a matter of months. But the number of SS and SA who were involved were met, if not dwarfed, by the enthusiastic participation of the Hungarians and the Hungarian gendarmerie. And yet, it's also a country that managed to protect its Jewish population until 1944, 3 years after the systematic annihilation of the Jews began in the rest of Nazi-occupied Europe. And this is a country, when we talk about diaspora and identity, where the sons and daughters of Holocaust survivors would spend much of their early lives not knowing that they were Jewish. And they had a Jewish grandmother lighting candles for Sabbath down the hall in the apartment, and they still did not recognize their own identity. Now, the reassertion of that identity has occurred over the recent years. So here is the story I'm going to tell. It can be boiled down into a very simple narrative. My mother's family, the Manfred Weiss family, were the largest Jewish industrialists in Hungary. This family of over 40 members were saved by making a deal with Heinrich Himmler, who was, as you know, the architect of the final solution. Remarkably, in this case, he kept his side of the bargain. My father was a Gentile and a Hungarian diplomat, and he tried to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies, which ended up forcing him into Dachau after the Germans invaded. So there's this paradox: the Jews were saved by Himmler, and the Gentile went to Dachau. So you can see the journalist in me recognized a great story. But there was also the other more personal story, and that's the tricky one, I think, for all of us who are children and who have parents who are often not always very forthcoming about who they are, what they were like. And that is that there was a love story between my mother and father, which I will get to later. Manfred Weiss was the perfect example of the assimilated Hungarian Jew. He never distanced himself from his religion. Indeed, he really mistrusted those who converted, considering it an example of an unsteady character. But he also wasn't very pious. The family grew up with Christmas trees. He and his 6 children had Christmas trees, Easter celebrations, pork and ham as part of their daily diet, regular diet. And at the same time, the family supported the Dohanitsa synagogue and celebrated the high holidays. Much like many of the Jews in the upper classes of their generation, they gradually became more and more assimilated, more enmeshed with the dominant culture. You know, you just have to look at the families of Moses Mendelssohn to see that the Manfred Weiss paradigm wasn't unique. The source of this, and this is my grandmother with the 4 generations of, and this is our link to each other, who is the great-grandmother, right, of Weiss, Manfred's wife. So as you can see, it's very close. The source of their enormous wealth was a factory on Chapel Island, which wasn't far from Budapest. This factory began by making canned goods, and then a lucrative contract with the army for those goods made Manfred Weiss realize that the shape of those cans could also be retrofitted to make little bullets and stoves. So gradually, the factory, which was initially in Budapest, had to move to this island because he didn't want to have a munitions factory in the heart of the city. Gradually, the factory grew and grew, and during wartime it went into production, heavy war production, and there were several wars to cope with. And then during times of peace, it manufactured everything, from safety pins to bicycles to terrible cars to pots and pans. And in the late 30s and the early 40s, Messerschmitt engines for the Germans, because as you know, Hungary was an ally of the Germans. The families, Anna de Waal died before, and when the children were very young, but despite their loss, family lived in great ease and splendor. And so this is the house, the back of the house of Andrássy út, which we will probably see. This is Manfred Weiss, my grandmother next to him, my Uncle George, who bears an incredible, Peter bears an incredible resemblance to. This is my aunt, my Aunt Edith, my Aunt Daisy Corin, whose daughter some of us will meet. This is my mother. This is my aunt, and this is my grandfather, who is asocial in front. The family, there were, as I said, many children, and there were tremendous marriages and intermarriages. So that at a certain point, this family accounted for 10% of the Hungarian GDP. His father, Zsigmond, my grandfather's father, Zsigmond, brought the Rothschild Bank into Hungary, and then it grew and became more autonomous. He created the Hungarian banking system. My grandmother's sister Daisy married Ferenc Korin, who was the head of the Organization of Industrialists and a descendant of the rabbi. They were hardly alone. 88% of the stock market members in Hungary at the time were Jews. 91% of the currency broker were Jews. I'm talking about before World War I. More than half of Hungarian industry was owned by Jews, and a quarter of all university students were Jews. Budapest Jews comprised about 20% of the city's population and were among the country's most ardent patriots. They made up 1/3, often 1/2 of the lawyers, doctors, journalists, printers, actors. And it was obviously a group of people that both shaped the country and attracted tremendous resentment and criticism. On the other side of the equation was my father, who kind of also represents a different strand of real Hungarian-ness. Here he is, you can figure out which one he is, with his formidable mother, Charlotte, and his less formidable but deeply resentful sister, Musi. And he was born in 1903. His grandfather was the founder of the Hungarian News Service, and his great-grandfather was one of the most famous painters in Hungary, an artist known as Miklós Barabás. My father's father was the highest civil servant in the Habsburg court, and his mother was a leader in Catholic women's organizations. You can just tell, can't you? So my father's formative years occurred during World War I, when everything changed. As we know, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was defeated in November 1918, and an era ended as well. An era when Hungary and Hungary being integrated as part of the European power was over. In this new era, Hungary was independent, without defensible borders or access to the sea. The end of the war, as we talked about today on the square, brought the Treaty of Trianon, which was, and in some ways continues to linger as a great national trauma, which deprived Hungary of 3/4 of its land and half of its population. The country entered a period of tremendous instability, political instability, and that culminated in the 1919 with the communist regime of Béla Kun. So you can see, here is where it all went, and here's where we are. But what so very close to Szeged and to what was once Hungary. So there were 133 days of communism in 1919. You have a little history lesson here to give you the context. And Béla Kun, mind you, was born Béla Kun. And so there was, in the Hungarian mind, a tremendous connection between communism and Judaism, a connection that did not end up serving the Jews very well over the years at all. And during that time, Manfred Weiss and his family fled and eventually rented a villa in Vienna. My father's father lost his job, and the family was plunged into a kind of genteel poverty. And the effects of the Hungarian regime, of this brief communist regime, was devastating to the Jews of Hungary. Despite suffering at their hands, they were collectively blamed for its excesses. So then the period of white terror began with the arrival of Miklós Horthy on November 16th, when the left was crushed and the white terror began. Here is an interesting picture of Horthy, who was known to be an anti-Semite, but nonetheless realized which side of the bread, which side his bread was buttered on. And here he is meeting Manfred Weiss, whose factory was completely stripped of anything by number of Romanians who were in Budapest at the time. But remarkably, he was able to get it going again for peacetime production, something that Horthy was extremely grateful for. And Horthy, at the time, attacked all those who were even remotely associated with the Kun regime, especially the Jews. One of the consequences of the Treaty of Trianon, which is something that Tamás was talking a little bit about, was that in the past, Hungary and the Austro-Hungarian empires filled with national minorities. And so the Jews were not, everybody knew there were Jews, but they were not singled out in the same way. But after the loss of the boundaries and the populations, the largest Jewish national minority largest Hungarian national minority were the Jews. And they became a lightning rod for all the free floating resentment and anxieties. After World War I, Jews accounted for about 6% of the total population, and they were then sanctioned later on with with the first anti-Semitic law in the 20th century in Europe, which was the Numerus Clausus Act passed in September of 1920. This was one of Horthy's signature pieces of legislation in which he determined that the number of Jews in the professions and the universities should be strictly connected to the percentage of Jews in the population. So if there were 6% of Jews in the population, there should not be more than that as doctors, lawyers, etc. And that created a tremendous middle area where Jews were working in sort of marginal positions who had formerly been professionals. Nonetheless, one of the other consequences was there were a lot of baptisms going on, and my family was no exception. These baptisms, though, were interesting because it wasn't just a question of religious conversion or even social conversion. It was an expression of a kind of patriotism that they wanted to. Many Jews and many upper-class Jews wanted to demonstrate that their loyalty was to Hungary and was not to whatever Jewish or communist regime that had previously been there. So there was, in our family, there were baptisms all over the place. And Rabbi Koren's great-grandson, Ferenc, baptized all the children. There's a wonderful story with Daisy, who was baptized, and her mother decided that before she went to school, she should know that her family had once been Jewish. So she said to her, when she was 7 years old, Daisy, I have to talk to you about this. You know that there are good people and there are bad people, and there are all sorts of religions. But the most important thing, there may be Jews, there may be Catholics, there may be Protestants, the most important thing is to be a good person. And she went on and gave what was, she thought, a very eloquent speech. And at the end of it, she said, so do you understand? She says, yes, Mama. And she said, do you have any questions? And she said, yes. She said, well, what's your question? She said, Mom, have you ever seen a Jew in your life? This is the great-great-granddaughter of Rabbi Aaron Koren asking this question. So the questions of assimilation are extremely complicated. This is the country house of my mother's family, INARAD, and it was, as you can imagine, a beautiful place outside of the city, with a gracious life and ease that was removed from the difficulties of most people in Hungary, no matter what their religion. My father, meanwhile, went to l'École de Sciences Politiques in Paris, and then he returned to become a diplomat. He and my mother did not know each other during the early years because my father was serving in Germany, where he was the assistant to the Hungarian ambassador. And there he attended the Nuremberg rallies. And there he also saw the terrible treatment of the Jews by the early Hitler regime. So he arrived in Berlin in 1933, which was kind of an important year. And he saw increasingly what was happening to the Jews in Berlin, many of whom were Hungarians, begging him if he could do anything to prevent their businesses and their apartment buildings from being taken away. And he couldn't. So he and my mother met in 1939, but they couldn't be public about their romance because, of course, he was prominent politically, and she was from a prominent Jewish family. And at that point, there were already laws prohibiting the intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles. So for 5 years, they courted in private, my father wrote many, many letters, which ended up being key to my discovery of their story. And then, as we all know, on March 19, 1944, the Germans invaded Hungary. And immediately, any relatively peaceful coexistence that existed, certainly there were labor camps, certainly there was terrible anti-Semitism. There were not ghettos, there were not exterminations, there were not pogroms until now. And at that point, the Germans became impatient, not only with Hungary's recalcitrance, but also the fact that there was still an intact Jewish community in Hungary. And that's also what makes things complicated with Horthy. So my father became the head of the political division in the Hungarian Foreign Ministry, and he tried to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies. When March 19, 1944 occurred, the family hid, and they all spread out throughout various hiding places. My grandfather and Corinne ended up hiding in the abbey in Zierz, and were immediately apprehended 2 days later. My mother and everyone else went to various friends' houses, but my grandfather and Corinne were first arrested and then taken to the Gestapo prison at the Astoria Hotel, where they were interrogated, and then sent to Mauthausen. My father was also arrested. He too was taken to the prison. He wandered around Budapest for about 3 weeks before he was finally arrested, and he knew he couldn't escape because he had seen too many stories of family members being tortured because of the disappearance of prominent political figures. Jews were rounded up, especially in the countryside. The situation for the Budapest Jews, the dire situation only came later. But in the countryside, Eichmann and the Hungarians operated with breathtaking efficiency. My mother, on April 6, 1944, was the moment when the Hungarian Jews were required to wear a star. And this is my mother's, which I found discarded in the bottom of this big bag she held our drawings and report cards and things like that. And it was almost a curious question as to why she kept it, but she did. So then my grandmother tried to figure out any way, as she was hiding, to get my grandfather out of Mauthausen, and she met Mrs. Inrady, who was the wife of an extremely anti-Semitic government official. And she asked with whom they had socialized in the past, and she asked her if there was any way she could help. And Mrs. Inrady said absolutely not, there was nothing she could do. And as she walked away, she turned around and said, "Now it's our turn." Which is something I think that we all can resonate with in a way of just what that must have felt like and the revenge that was implicit in that statement. Mauthausen, as you probably know, was a quarry. By the time my grandfather and Fenerbahce arrived there, its production levels had slacked a bit. But it was not an extermination camp, it was a labor camp, a brutal labor camp, and where lots of people died. My father and Ferenc Corin, whose face is this, who bears little resemblance, or maybe a little resemblance to Rabbi Corin, was in Mauthausen as well, but unusually he got taken out. And the reason he got taken out was because of this man named Kurt Becker. And Becker was one of the close adjutants of Heinrich Himmler. And seeing the end of the war, or a possible German defeat in the cards, Becker decided that he was going to figure out maybe how to make a deal. Because the family holdings in Hungary at that point, well, for many points, were extremely important. There was big factories that were manufacturing munitions. There were coal mines. There was also, obviously, the financial situation. The question is, they could have just taken them. But there was a big battle between Goering and Himmler. And Himmler wanted to figure out his way of winning that battle, because they both wanted the factories. Goering had his Goering-Werke, and Himmler wanted his. So enter Kurt Becker, who decided to work with Ferenc Koren, who was one of the most powerful industrialists in Hungary, to make a deal. Now again, those questions of chance, which we'll be hearing about so much regarding your family, and is clearly at work here. Why did they keep their side of the bargain? We never know. My grandmother often wondered if it wasn't just because, or my family wondered if it wasn't just because Becker realized what was happening and figured it wouldn't be the worst thing to have a few rich Jews on his side during the war crimes trials. And as it turns out, it was helpful because Ferenc Koren testified on his behalf. They negotiated a deal, and it meant the family ended up getting passage to Portugal or Switzerland in exchange for the factories, the paperwork, and there was a little moment of quibbling between whether it should be a 35-year lease or a 25-year lease. And they both realized if the Germans won the war, it didn't matter, and if the Germans lost the war, it wouldn't matter. So they decided to just sign things away. When everything was, they gathered all the family from their hiding places back in Budapest, and the family signed away all that they had. My Aunt Elsa, who was my grandmother's sister, widowed with 7 children when she was 34, and a notorious spendthrift, said if I'd known we had this much, I would have spent more. And she probably should have. Becker was installed in Koren's house, and curiously, Daisy went to visit him many years later because the von Einsiedels were friends with Becker, who went on to become a prosperous textile merchant. And in, again, these odd ways that historic and familial strands intersect. Daisy went to visit him and saw in various places a number of the little tchotchkes from her family in his place. So they went to Portugal, and who else were there but the Gabor sisters, the famous family, who had also nice Jewish girls, who also got out because Magda was having an affair with the Portuguese ambassador to Hungary at the time. He was recalled. He felt worried about his girlfriend, and so figured that since the Weiss family got such a good deal, his girlfriend could too. So the family, Magda, her husband, or her mother, and her mother's husband all ended up in the same hotel with my very straight-laced family. And people were, the Mama Gabor kept telling my grandmother that if you just let her at these young girls, to beautify them a little bit, she could get them married and shot, but she never did. Meanwhile, in Dachau, my father got typhus and was saved, actually, by getting so sick. And eventually, they were liberated. This is a picture of my father in his striped suit. But when they were liberated, he would, as you can see, this is another thing I found in the bottom of this. It says, it is hereby, it's the Camp Office of Dachau, written in English, the Day of Deliverance by the American Army. And it was on the 14th of November, that's when he was arrested in November. And so there he was prisoner number 125739, and he became responsible for repatriating the Hungarian prisoners of war back to Budapest, or back to Hungary. When he returned to Hungary, he didn't quite make it to Hungary. He first had to do a little detour because there were so few people who could end up assuming leadership positions, and he was one of them. So the Americans took him to Paris, and he never figured out why. But from there, he managed to contact my mother, who was still in Portugal and had no idea if he was alive or dead. And he wrote her quite a beautiful letter in which he said,
broken and without a job. I am asking you to be my wife. And she said, yes. He wasn't without a job for long because the Hungarian government was in such a fragile state. And it was during a very brief coalition government between 1945, the end of 45, and 1947. And he was made the minister to the United States, which was an ambassadorial rank. When they returned to Budapest, the city was ruined. The Germans had blown up the bridges. People were begging. There was the beginning of some little commerce. My mother traveled there, finally, from Portugal, and she said they stopped first in Vienna, and she said everybody was destitute. And when you got to Budapest, all of a sudden there was activity in the streets. People were selling anything they could. There was some beginning of some fragile sense of the future, despite how wrecked everything was. So they married in December of 1945, and then immediately took one of these planes, I have no idea where that picture comes from, and arrived in the United States in January of 1946, where they became the nice young couple. And here's the bride of the diplomatic corps finds Washington a fascinating new world, where there were a few little things that were hidden, as you can imagine. Meanwhile, back in Hungary, life was getting more and more dominated by the communists. My father organized bringing the Hungarian delegation. Here is obviously Harry Truman. Here is the Prime Minister, Ferenc Nagy. Here is Rákosi, who is the evil communist who ended up finally taking over, and an assortment of other ministers. There's my dad. And this was one of the high points. But clearly, my father could see things were going bad. And eventually, in 1947, he had to resign because the communists had taken over the country completely. My mother's family was doing their best to get out of Portugal and try to get the precious American visas, which they finally succeeded in doing. And my father ended up staying in the United States, where we were all born. So this is the sort of the broad outlines of this story. But I'd like to bring us a little bit more up to date, because this is this famous, notorious memorial to 1944 that was erected in Hungary amidst great controversy. This was, did I just lose my signal? Maybe. Can you hear me anyway? Yeah. So this was created several years ago by the very nationalistic government that decided to portray Hungary as the poor innocent victim of German aggression. It's not a great picture, but you can see the crying angel of Hungary being attacked by the German eagle, innocent and victimized as this angel was. It caused a tremendous amount of controversy because it gets to the question of history. Whose history is it? Who owns it? How do you tell it? What does it mean? What are the facts? And what was fascinating is that as this monument was being erected in the evenings, it was also being taken down and demonstrated against during the day. And there was this whole kind of spontaneous art that sprung up around the perimeter of this monument, with people still 70 years later grappling with the questions and the challenges of identity, of history, of culpability, of who is the victim and who are the perpetrators. And that is, I think, brings us to one of my favorite line quotations from Kundera, Milan Kundera, who said, "The bloody massacre in Bangladesh quickly covered over the memory of the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. The assassination of Allende drowned out the groans of Bangladesh. The war in the Sinai Desert made people forget Allende. The Cambodian massacre made people forget Sinai, and so on and so forth, until ultimately everyone lets everything be forgotten." And I think we won't. I think that the purpose of this gathering today, the purpose of our family stories, of our memories, of our histories, and our hopeless and sometimes helpful attempts at getting to something that looked like the truth, is what will prevent anything from being forgotten. So I thank you all for bearing with me this evening, and again, my deepest thanks.
You would agree that there is only one thing that one can say in my place, and that is thank you.
Yes.